Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez welcoming you all to another lecture here in Travolution Tours, where we, essentially disseminate different aspects of knowledge that I have acquired over the years in the production of either my PhD studies or through my tour guiding. So, in case that you don't know us and what we're doing here, please let me give you a brief introduction. I am a doctor with a PhD in history from the University of Winchester. I've been running Travolution tours now for over 3 years, and the goal of all of these lectures and public events is to, essentially get people together to learn about history, culture, and in the occasions of traveling in a way that is accessible and affordable. So today our lecture is sponsored by all of our members, supporters, and overall patrons in our PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. Please have a look in the links. That's the way that you can support us in paypal.me/Travolution Tours or buymeacoffee/Travolution. And it is thanks to their support that today I can bring you this item of English history that is often forgotten about. In fact, by now you probably will have known that I normally have a nice little slide at the end of a lecture or something to encourage people further reading, but actually available literature on Lollardy is quite poor these days. I even remember as a student, in the sort of 2010 2011 period to struggle to find actually proper accessible information on this beyond the paywalls of academic societies. So that is one of the reasons why I'm also doing this, because I have found that given different topics that we've spoken about, different histories, different locations of traveling, Lollardy and a few aspects of English history are not so well known. So I just wanted to bring some of that in here. So this is what we're gonna do. It's a relatively brief talk in comparison to many of my other talks, I guess. But hopefully this will give you a better understanding of what is this little hiccup in the later history of the Middle Ages in England all about. So, what's the deal with Lollardy and John Wycliffe, right? Well, historically, there has been a thought that the Lollards were somehow involved in sedition, and for this we need a tiny bit of context. Consider that the moment when the Lollards rise up, which is in the late 14th century, early 15th century, Britain and well, the whole world has gone through the period of the Black Death. We are knees deep into the Hundred Years' War and or the War of the Roses. So it's a period of turbulence all throughout, which, well, means there is instability running rampant. Never a good background for anything that could happen. Well, enter the scene the leader of the Lollards, who is this man, John Wycliffe. Now, John Wycliffe had some very innovative ideas about the church, or at least innovative for Britain, right? And England specifically. A core belief of his was that the clergy was essentially exceeding their job on earth. They were interfering beyond what they were supposed to do, which was essentially, teach and preach. Well, moreover, Lollardy was quite proactive on the personal interpretation of the Bible, and that meant that lay preaching was actually a perfectly good substitute for what the clergy was doing in the church or in any other religious institution, which I'm sure you can all understand raised some alarm bells. So, of course, this will be found 100% illegal, and Parliament will find a way of issuing action against them. So, within this, the Lollards will also promote the use of vernacular instead of Latin, which actually made access to things like the Bible a lot more accessible for the ordinary peasant. We can already add into the equation that Latin wasn't the most popular English, language speaking in England, because, well, a whole backlog of history we don't quite have time to cover today. But this was a fundamental problem. People were asked to go to church. They could not read or write. They had to follow through what one person and one person only was telling them was the truth. It kind of didn't sit down well with a few scholars and a few minds who genuinely thought that, well, if it's supposed to be divine intervention and all this kind of interaction with God, shouldn't it be actually possible to do this all one by one and actually interpret the parables of the Bible like Jesus meant us to, which is actually by our own independent thinking? Yeah, not necessarily something that was terribly cool with the powers above. But to take that one step further, there were some other controversial problems within Lollardy. The teachings of John Wycliffe, they directly denied the sacraments. They didn't themselves get involved in any kind of fasting, no abstinence, no day of rest on Sunday, etc., etc. So these are already far too many no, no, no to the ordinary core backbone of society. So this is gonna eventually lead to, well, many, many problems. But what I have to emphasize is that the main issue wasn't this or that in terms of religious practice. John Wycliffe and the majority of Lollards question and actively challenge the concept of dominion. Now, dominion is a very important concept for the Middle Ages. It's essentially the authority over property that the state and more importantly the church had, which is the whole fundamental core to feudalism and eventually capitalism. So imagine this. These radical preachers were saying, hey, yeah, anybody can pick up a Bible and tell you if this is okay or not. More importantly, are you sure you should be holding all of this power and taxes from these poor peasants? That doesn't seem right. So I'm sure you all start realizing how, well, essentially, this was a big social, political, and economic rupture in the system. And this is where the confrontation begins, really. Well, as the movement is going to carry on forward, and not only Lollardy is going to be casting doubt over the legal authority of institutions well established like the church, they are also going to be found as opposing faith of preachers. So the rivalry is really going to take things to the extreme. Most people at this moment in time, as a result, will reach the natural conclusion, I guess, that Lollardy could do nothing but harbor rebellion. And between one thing and the other, it had to be stopped. And this is how we get to this moment. The heretico comburendo. This is a wonderful act that essentially allows the clergy to get rid of their nuisance. This happens in 1401, if I remember correctly, and it pretty much says that any recurrent heretical, I guess, disposition will be severely persecuted and punished to the point of imposing death penalty. So, as you can see, the clergy and anyone that could essentially make use of a few lollards going missing was given a blanche card. And yet, Lollardy was on the rise. Here you have this lovely, quite colorful map that shows you well where Lollardy was actually increasing in the 15th century and the divide that was affected by Lollardy before the time of the death of the Richard II. There is also this problem in here. We're going to go through several kings in England at this moment in time because of our own political shenanigans, and often the political association with one party or another will put you in the radar of what is legal, what is not, and what is heretical and what is not. So, riddle me this. The overall sect, cult, whatever you want to call it, of the Lollards, actually had support, not just amongst ordinary people, not just, amongst a few intellectuals, but also with some members of the nobility, particularly what we call the Lollard Knights. And the Lollard Knights were growing. Now, the Lollard Knights have often been associated with the support of the regime of Richard II, who had been quite violently overthrown and then usurped by Henry IV. So, as you see, we have this issue with Richard, which gets, frankly, put in a nasty situation by several other issues. Richard the Second is going to be one of the kings shortly after the Black Death who's going to have to deal with a lot of the upheaval and general nasty situations happening at that moment in time, not just in Britain, but everywhere. The very moment of upheaval and then usurpation of the throne by Henry IV is just going to highlight the further issues that we have in terms of political stability in the country. And, Henry was already on a shaky boat with this. He had suffered the rebellion of the Earls shortly after he performs this. And now heresy was running rampant and gaining numbers. So it had to be dealt with. This was a serious problem for those in power. So, since there was some kind of connection between the Lollard Knights and the remnants of support for Richard II, since these Lollards are appearing left, right, and center, things start really getting out of control. And unfortunately, the sets of events that will take place around this time period will not necessarily do any favors to the belief that Lollardy was a treacherous thing. There is some correspondence and writings within the very same circle of some Lollards, and I would like to point out some, not every single man in the house, saying that, well, maybe there ought to be some kind of rebellion against the state and the king himself. And there had been previous rebellions in England that had actually led to make an easy connection between Lollardy and revolt. Let's rewind to 1381, the year when the Peasants' Revolt blows out of proportion. Now, the Peasants' Revolt does not occur as a result of Lollardy. In fact, the Peasants' Revolt, more than anything, is a direct result from the many problems that we see in Europe as a direct result of the Black Death. Peasants that had been enduring hard labor, but yet some marginal benefits as a result of the Black Death with increased wages and a little bit more freedom, start being squashed once again by the nobles who think that this period of extra freedom and not so high taxes, etc., etc., is done now because the pestilence is gone, right? So let's squash those peasants. And the peasants say, no way, we've been essentially saving you from starvation after half of the human population died. Somehow we are not going to let you get away with murder. So the peasants will rise and revolt. Now the problem is the peasants' revolt will be completely squashed by the king's army and the nobility, but it will lay a ground for, essentially better work conditions moving forward. However, and this is an important however, one of the leaders of the rebellion actually was a Lollard preacher, and this is John Ball. So, I'm sure you start seeing where the situation starts getting tricky. Up until 1382, the Lollards had been more or less tolerated, kept at a distance, but tolerated. Now, these peasants have risen in rebellion, and some Lollards have been found at the forefront of this problem. That's starting to look a bit more suspicious. And that is where a lot of the gears start shifting against them. And although there are many, many other reasons as to why things like the Peasants' Revolt and the general state of civil unrest in England are legitimate, well, the religious sedition as to why all of this was happening was in part the ever paranoid growing situation in the English powers that will start seeing a bit too much through the looking glass. And for whatever reason happened to be on that day, they needed to look for motives and excuses and scapegoats. And this is how, like I said, the situation starts getting out of control. But more on this happens as the influence of Lollardy spreads beyond the realm of Britain, because so does enter the scene Jan Hus. Now, Jan Hus is this guy who around 1390 starts his career as a student of theology in Prague. And Jan Hus was pretty fond of the ideas that John Wycliffe had developed in England. So, this is the moment in time when we're going to realize the serious impact that these rebellious-like religious attitudes could emerge like not just in England but in the rest of Europe. Because although John Wycliffe and most of the Lollards didn't necessarily endorse violence, etc., etc., the problem with Jan Hus and the Hussites is the following. In 1403, the university in Prague is going to condemn a number of the opinions of Wycliffe as completely heretical and not okay. And this is going to lead to what we call the whole Hussite movement all across Bohemia. Now, it is true that in the particular case study of the Hussites and Jan Hus, a lot of the problems rise actually from a political perspective rather than a religious perspective, and that is because we are now in the middle of the shenanigans that have been produced by the Holy Roman Empire in a city like Prague that has had a few changes in power administration, etc. But not just that, in the region of Bohemia. The Kingdom of Bohemia historically had been a culture and a people of its own right. Now they had been completely absorbed into this other Germanic power that, to some extent, we could argue was repressing certain items of culture within the area. What John Hus is rising up against is not so much the religious, I guess, misguidance or misconception of the Catholic Church at this moment in time, but a lot of the uh, inequity, injustice, imbalance that seems to be from a legal perspective, not just in his town, but in the overall, I guess, area. And that is the problem, that in the case of Jan Hus, a lot more nobles, a lot more members of the army, etc., are gonna join in, and this will become a full-blown political war. In fact, we call it the Hussite Wars for a reason, rather than a spat over religious semantics. Having this in consideration, imagine the powers in England shaking in their boots. Yeah, this is where things are gonna get really, really tricky. So, as a result of this, there is also gonna be what we call the Oldcastle Revolt, which I guess probably didn't contribute to the subject. Now, I'll cut the long story short, but it pretty much puts the Lollards in the forefront as undeniably heretical. Well, the long story is that John Oldcastle, who was actually a good friend of our king, now a new king, Henry V, because this is the period of complete stability in England. He essentially is rooted out in the early stages of 1410 as a Lollard. Right? He's investigated for all of this. He's put on trial in 1413 and he's condemned to prison. He's actually incarcerated in the Tower of London and he escapes from here. And in the process of escaping, he will promote a small uprising, which, although ultimately failed and was quite catastrophic in that regards, will 100% put the Lollards once again in the epicenter of rebellion, because he is deemed to be a Lollard. He has some friend for some Lollard and from some other political friends. Therefore, they are all Lollards, they are all rebels, they are all religious heretics. I'm sure you can see how easy it is to follow this story. So, this will eventually lead, by the way, to the burning of Oldcastle, like many, many other people, because remember that that previous act of Parliament had essentially given them the ability to get rid of any of these perceived enemies of the state more than of God. So, whether the events happen with or without Lollard help, it cannot be ignored that during this time period, the chaos is running rampant all throughout England. And although the revolts may have stemmed from different issues, it was unfortunately very easy to find Lollardy somewhere. And well, although I am still very much of the opinion that although there may have been some suggestion in what the Lollards were preaching in terms of, free thinking, free interpretation, etc., which could lead to an idea of a better desire for freedom and less oppression, I don't actually think the vast majority of the Lollards sincerely wanted the state to fall or to cause these kind of upheavals. And I do not think that the Lollards are to blame for this whole mess, or at least not in totality. There's a lot of other factors that come into consideration in here. Like I said, if we were talking about Jan Hus and his friends, completely different story. This is gonna blow into a whole war, into a division of factions that will fight for supremacy in the area, well, if not just Prague, but the whole of Bohemia. In England, is mostly, like I said, a semantics spat as to who wants to be top dog in the area, whether it's regarding religious freedom or the overall power over the masses. And this is a problem. The evidence do not support at all that Wycliffe and the majority of his congregation had violent thoughts, but public perception seemingly was different. And part of that is probably because both the state and the church had plenty of reasons to fear and dislike the Lollards. And as we know, when someone is uncomfortable and in a position of power, they will use their position of power against their opposition. And normally that means taking drastic measures against them. And so, Lollardy becomes, well, essentially a very convenient scapegoat for all the tremendous devastation that is happening in England at this moment in time. And yet, precisely because of this, it will be a fundamental element of change in the country a few years later when the Reformation starts being in full swing. Because Wycliffe influences Jan Hus. Jan Hus will influence no other than Martin Luther himself. And Martin Luther, of course, through the areas of Calvinism and what have you not, will come back swinging into England and into the reign of the Tudors. So, sedition or no sedition, this is the power of thinking differently. Now, thinking differently is a double-edged coin, as you know, guys. You need to use it wisely and you need to use it carefully. But one of the reasons why I'm saying this is, once again, because I think we can find many parallels between not just the Lollards or Jan Hus, but many of the different religious movements and belief movements that happen in the Middle Ages. Notice how there is not just a religious element in the equation, but always some kind of political and social problem at the base of the whole situation. In the world that we're in, thinking for ourselves is a very powerful tool. The more we become independent for what, regimes, and I mean regimes in the strict sense of the word, wants us to believe, and whether this regime is a political regime or a marketing regime, it's important. Thoughts like this were crucial to debunk the very establishment of strong systems like feudalism. Such idea is also true for ourselves within capitalism and within, well, actually the period of almost post-capitalism, I guess, that we are living in. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if some guys in the 14th century could think about it, maybe it's not so surreal. Maybe there was a point. And the point is not rebellion necessarily, or maybe it is. I don't know. I'll leave that entirely up to you, whether you think the Lollards were indeed treacherous or not. But the point is that there is a certain degree of health into challenging what is established. And if it has enough support, well, it can lead to consequences, rebellious or otherwise. And on that note, we will call this a relatively short lecture for today. I hope this has given you a different insight into this perhaps more obscure history of Britain, England specifically, and this item of religious studies that seems to be much forgotten in this day and age, and yet is incredibly powerful with very heavy repercussions. And on that note, I shall love you and leave you. I'm wishing you a good day and see you later. Bye bye.